give this to you?
Yep.
We're just about in business here.
You're right.
I think we're in business.
Oh, we're in business.
Yeah.
Great.
We have tickets if someone is collecting them.
No one was collecting them when I think. Oh, wait a minute. You know what? I think they're keeping them for bookkeeping.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, they would be.
But I don't know who the ticket taker is.
If no one needs them, can we hawk them out front?
Make a lot of money.
Scalp 'em.
Let's see. I'm looking for a ticket taker coming in the door there. How are we doing on time?
Well, you know, it's 20 minutes to 4.
Okay.
Later, would you do a private head count? We'll see how many people are there. Head count. Head count. Head count. Not head.
Put a
Head
collection
count.
plate.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, thank you everyone for your patience. We're coming right along here. You want to test?
No. This mic's the only mic you see.
Okay, this is a, okay. Thanks everyone again for your patience, and we'll move right along. Our next speaker is Richard Dolan. Many of you know a lot about his background, but if you don't, you're about to find out. This is a very powerful presentation. He studied history, English, and philosophy as an undergraduate at Alfred University. His deep passion for the discipline of history resulted in a scholarship to study at Oxford University and a near miss for a Rhodes Scholarship. He chose instead to do graduate work at the University of Rochester, where he focused on German and Soviet studies before moving on to American Cold War diplomacy. Not wanting to teach, or actually preferring to do something a little different, he left academia to write. In 1994, he became interested in the UFO issue, approaching it from the angle of history and politics. He was intrigued by the cultural schizophrenia, and that's a word or a term that I think that you're going to be hearing a lot of. The fact that mainstream and academic culture, the official culture that is, continued to treat UFOs as amusement, but that also so many intelligent people privately take it so seriously. Through 1995, 96, and 97, he conducted a systematic bibliographical search, hunting down the many out-of-print books and UFO documents released over the years through the Freedom of Information Act, and that was quite a challenge. He found the amount of information nearly overwhelming. A detailed chronology of relevant events was prepared in advance of writing his critically acclaimed book, UFOs and the National Security State, Chronology of a Cover-Up, 1947 to 1973. This book provides the crucial foundation everyone needs, which is a clear, comprehensive, but concise historical narrative of the problem. He's now at work on his second volume, which will take the story through the remainder of the 20th century to present day and should be completed in about 2 years. He's on a quest to find out what happened and when it happened and why there are documented facts that are conflicting with what we now have in our history books. And he wants to get the history books straightened out. His focus is not on whether UFOs exist, but strictly from the political aspect. It's my pleasure to welcome Richard Dolan.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks so much. Thank you. This talk, of course, is about what I'll be doing in the second book, taking the UFO historical narrative to the present day. And I'll be covering a bit of that here. As a matter of fact, due to advances in light speed technology, I had actually had a copy of a book that I apparently wrote 20 years from now that deals with UFO cover-up from 2005 to 2025. I didn't make a backup and accidentally deleted it before I came here, so I don't know what's in it, unfortunately. But I do have the... I'd like to raise this up if I can do that, but I'll just carry this like this. I am very, very glad to be here. Oh, thank you, Francis. Perfect. Thank you for your patience, by the way. And I hope that this will be very interesting. I want to encourage... forget it. I encourage you to interrupt, ask questions. If I'm not talking about something that you would like to discuss, feel free. This is a workshop. Rather than put you to work with dittos and all of that stuff, I figure it's best if you simply interact in the manner that you are most interested in doing. And if that means interjecting in any manner, by all means, I'm happy to do that. I do have a lot of notes here prepared, and I will gladly go through those. So let me just start, and as Cheryl mentioned in her introduction, aside from UFOs, I have a very strong interest in politics and history in general. I'm now interested in, I guess I call it parapolitics, deep politics, subterranean history. When you're in academic life, that kind of stuff really is seriously frowned upon. I mean, not merely UFOs, but my goodness, don't even go out there on something like, I don't know, the Kennedy assassination. They really will not take you seriously if you believe that there was a conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy, if you can believe this. And I'm not kidding. So I've moved away, thankfully, from the hardcore academic environment. A very rigid one after a while. I loved it, absolutely loved it, and I'm glad I'm away. Now, regarding my book, Volume 1 and Volume 2, which I'm working on, one thing that I try to do is to describe a variety of conspiratorial types of, let's say not conspiratorial, bad things that people in power do regarding secrecy, cover-ups, and so on, that are not directly related to UFOs, but that are nonetheless important in my opinion. Things like domestic spying on American citizens by the National Security Agency, or all those grisly mind control experiments by the CIA and Army and other agencies. That's something that I do cover briefly. Plutonium injections, sensory deprivations on people who didn't give their permission, testing of biological agents. This happened in New York City when I was a boy in 1966. I was 4 years old. New York City subway system was sprayed with, by the U.S. Army with bacteria. No one knew at the time. I assume it didn't do anything to me. I included those matters and continue to include them, not to convict by circumstantial evidence about UFO conspiracies. It's not my intention, nor is it my intention to be a bad, unpatriotic American, in particular in this post-Patriot Act age, God forbid. But what I want to point out is that on a structural basis, the UFO cover-up, all right, and maybe that is the best word, is nothing unique in American history. It is nothing unique in our society. It is standard operating procedure. Many of the secrets that we know, we have this myth in our society that there are no secrets. Can this work here now? Wait, wrong way. There we go. We have this belief that we have an open society, which compared with some other societies, we do. Compared with what we think our society is, it is not especially open. Many of the things that we know, I mentioned mind control experiments, for instance, a moment ago. We know about these by mistake. We know about them by a roll of the dice. For instance, there's a picture of Richard Helms up on the screen there. Richard Helms directed the CIA from 1966 to 73 and knew pretty much everything there was to know, I think, within the agency. That appears to be the case. And when he left, he was fired by Nixon after Richard Nixon got reelected. And Nixon said, well, you got a month to clean out your office. Helms went nuts. He had all of these secrets. He's thinking, what do I do about the MK Ultra project? No one knows about this. I can't let anyone know. He told Sidney Gottlieb, who ran the program, destroy all records. Get rid of everything. And Gottlieb did a pretty good job in getting rid of evidence, but he wasn't quite thorough enough, and left a few boxes of documents pertaining to, like, financial records pertaining to MK Ultra, the mind control program. A few years later, they were found by journalist John Marks, and that is how we learned, okay, about MK Ultra. Now, had Gottlieb had a little more time, we wouldn't have known. Same thing applies to other federal branches, such as the FBI. Under J. Edgar Hoover, Hoover had an enormous stash of documents that were not in the FBI filing system at all. They were labeled official and confidential. They were outside the system. If you were to do a search on them, if you were to do a FOIA request on them, you wouldn't get them because they didn't exist. They were the most personal, the best stuff that Hoover had on people. We know about them because his secretary, when Hoover died, tried to get rid of them, didn't get rid of all of them. Okay. So, as Richard Helms says in that quote up there, the first rule in keeping secrets is nothing on paper. This is certainly what happens. Things don't go on paper, or when they do, there are ways to keep things out of circulation. If I'm a federal person and I have secrets I want to keep, maybe I can give them to people in private industry. If I have UFO secrets, maybe I've got a good friend at Lockheed, good connections in the private world, and documents go out so that they're not subject to such controls like a Freedom of Information Act. What I said in my lecture yesterday, and I want to repeat today, is that let us not forget that we retain our precious freedoms, the ones that we have, through the preservation, in large part, of our our heritage, our historical documents. And that heritage is preserved first and foremost through documents. No documents, no heritage. No heritage, no freedom. A functioning republic requires an informed citizenry. Otherwise, how can people rule? You become informed through reading and analyzing documents. And that is why these are very important, and I'm going to be going through these today for the last 30 years of this history. I want to review the last 3 decades of the UFO phenomenon, dealing with it as I did previously from a national security perspective. I want to show you this is a problem that is not merely a Cold War trifle, and it has not gone away. All right. These are some U.S. Defense Department documents regarding Spanish UFOs from 1974. 1974 is a little appreciated year in UFO history. There's a lot of activity at that time in Europe. There's a possible UFO crash that occurred in Wales in January of that year. That is still currently being investigated by the British, now American journalist Nick Redfern. It includes, that case includes reports of an RAF mountain rescue team to investigate the case, to scare off witnesses. Very interesting stuff. Then what you have that spring was a significant wave of very well-documented UFO sightings, many of which involved European military personnel. In particular, we have a lot of data from Spain. Many of these reports found their way into the files of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. These are 2 pages from the DIA reports. They essentially came from local newspaper clippings, okay, organized, however, in nice military fashion and forwarded to the Pentagon in the words, strictly for information of those parties interested. Now, one question you want to ask is, and who would these people be? One of the documents tells us that on one night, one of the witnesses was the chauffeur of the president of the Cadiz Provincial Commission. Cadiz is off the Atlantic coast on the southern part there, near Gibraltar. And a local big shot guy. And they're on the highway, and they see a luminous metal object, very brilliant. They felt a strange sensation, and the car came to a near stop. Not much more information in there. There are some other interesting accounts. Some indicate very clearly unusual maneuvering capabilities, such as this, quote, round, intense, torch-like light rose out of the water near a huge rock, traveled at low altitude, then fell into the water again. This happened twice. Or unconventional shapes, such as oval objects, rhomboid, saucer-shaped objects, and so on. And quite a few sightings of beings in this wave. This is one. A truck driver saw, quote, 3 silver ships on the highway with a light similar to floodlight. Figures approached him. He ran. They followed. He saw that they were tall, about 2 meters tall, about 6.5 feet tall, I guess. They had arms and legs. He could not see or make out their faces. They eventually returned to their ships and left. The next day, a civil defense unit investigated and found a distinctive hole in the ground. The truck driver said, I didn't do it. Now, these reports do not prove that alien beings are here, obviously. Of course, that's a reasonable explanation, maybe, if you combine these with some other things that we know. However, if we treat them cautiously, we can still make some important conclusions. First, the quantity of Spanish reports, which, by the way, coincided with reports from around the rest of Europe, tells us almost certainly that people were seeing and experiencing something very unusual. Something that appeared to be technological, something that appeared to be intelligent. The technology of which strongly appeared to be beyond any capabilities then or now. I mean, you know, objects going in and out of water. We're talking about 1974. Secondly, the U.S. Defense Department does not seem to have believed that these reports were nonsense. I say that because they were carefully culled from local newspaper accounts. They were carefully organized, carefully packaged, and sent on to unspecified interested parties. Well, you know, of course they would be interested in this. Who would not be? And I would just add, this is the kind of thing that can drive a UFO researcher crazy, because this is exactly the kind of stuff that we are interested in. We get laughed at or dismissed for it. But the military, you know, they are interested in this. The incidents in Spain did not end in 1974. There were several extraordinary sightings over the next few years. In October 1976, shortly after the death of Francisco Franco, who ruled that country for many years, a Spanish journalist named Juan Benitez received a release of a large number of Spanish UFO documents. There were about 300 pages in this worth of reports. Benitez reviewed the documents. He said, it becomes definitely categorically clear that the UFOs exist and quite evidently are a matter of the deepest concern to the governments of the whole planet. Now, let's see if I can, there we go. Now, Benitez interviewed a general, Spanish general, Carlos Castro Cavero, who told him everything is in a process of investigation, both in the United States and in Spain, as well as the rest of the world. And Cavero would not give an official position, okay? He gave a personal position. Here's what he said. I believe that UFOs are spaceships or extraterrestrial craft. The nations of the world, listen carefully, the nations of the world are currently working together in the investigation of the UFO phenomenon. There is an international exchange of data. Maybe then this group of nations, maybe when this group of nations acquires more precise and definite information, it will be possible to release the news to the world. I have a comment I'm going to make about that position at the end of this lecture. I don't think that's exactly the right way to look at this. I'll tell you why later. The general also added something of interest. He said, I myself have observed one UFO for more than an hour. It was an extremely bright object which remained stationary there for that length of time and then shot off, covering the distance of 20 kilometers in less than 2 seconds. No human device, he concluded, is capable of such speed. So that's what one general said in an unofficial capacity. The Spanish military offered its own official conclusion. And I think this is important because we know that the U.S. and Spanish governments have shared a lot of information with each other. And we know from the Spanish sources, the military sources, that they share UFO information with American sources. The Spanish Air Force stated in that 1976 report, go over here. Great. This is the most circumspect, convoluted use of language. I don't care if it's translated, it's still awful. If we study jointly the 3 reports issued up to now, we would have to face seriously the necessity of having to consider the possibility of accepting the hypothesis, I'm not kidding here, that a craft of unknown origin and driven by an energy likewise unknown is operating freely in the skies. Can you imagine how terrified they were writing this sentence? They had to be. Talk about qualifications. There have been some skeptics of this case, like James Oberg, who argue simply that the Spanish did not know how to investigate their own UFO sightings. And in fact, Oberg attributed the entire wave that I'm referring to here to the launchings of the Poseidon missiles by U.S. submarines in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I've read his analysis, which I have to say at best is threadbare. And like so many other approaches to debunkery, only works if you throw out most of the evidence. Then it works great. Here we are. Now we're moving on to the United States. And this, I think, is very, very important in the history of not merely UFO phenomena, but in the history of the United States. This is Loring Air Force Base, October 1975. Absolutely one of the most extraordinary events in the history of UFOs were the intrusions over several Air Force bases along the U.S. northern border in late 1975. From Montana to Maine, unknown intruders were having their way quite easily with American air defenses. These intrusions were only part of the full story. From late summer all through the fall, there had been unambiguous reports throughout the western United States of UFOs, of cattle mutilations, and heavy traffic of unmarked black helicopters where no such traffic had previously occurred. All new, all happening at the same time. Many people who have studied these reports believe that they were connected with the military intrusions, these black helicopters. I'm going to restrict my focus here to the military intrusions since we have clear documentation, clear proof that they happened. During the last 2 weeks of October, there were several visual sightings and radar trackings of unconventional and fast-moving objects by various Air Force bases, as well as by NORAD, North American Air Defense. The first major intrusion of the wave, however, took place in northern Maine at Loring Air Force Base on 2 consecutive nights, October 27th and October 28th, 1975. Now, on the night of the 27th, listen carefully. This is an amazing story. Some of you are familiar with this, I'm sure. Control tower personnel tracked an object on radar that was heading toward the base. They repeatedly tried to communicate with this object. They repeatedly failed. At 7:45 p.m., a base security officer saw an object penetrate the base's perimeter at a very low altitude, about 300 feet. This object had a red navigation light. It had a white strobe light. It descended to an altitude of 150 feet. It came to within 300 yards of the weapons area of the base. That action brought the base to major alert status. Within minutes, security vehicles converged from all over the base. Fighter coverage was requested from 2 NORAD regions, and interestingly, both requests were denied. Military police conducted security sweeps of the weapons storage area, just looking to see if anything was going on. Inside and out, they found nothing. The craft moved into a circling pattern and began flying toward Great Falls, which is just over the Canadian border. Now, this is certainly strange, but, possibly explainable as a helicopter, although you have to ask what kind of helicopter is going to be doing this. There's not a clear explanation. Things became stranger, much stranger the following night. On that night, the 28th, several security guards saw what appeared to be running lights of an aircraft approaching the base. Command post was alerted that the unknown object had apparently returned, the unknown object from the previous night. So from 7:45 p.m. until 8:20 p.m., almost an hour, this object was under constant observation, both visually and by control tower radar personnel. It was about 3 miles north of the Loring perimeter at that time. A white flashing light could be seen easily, as well as an amber-colored light. The object appeared and disappeared several times from view. At one point, it appeared over the end of the runway at an altitude of 150 feet. Then, it shut off its lights and appeared to have left. But it didn't leave, because when it reappeared, it was directly over the weapons storage area. Now, a number of witnesses thought that it looked like a stretched-out football. According to one of them, this is a B-52 crew chief, this is what he said, quote, "It hovered in midair as everyone in the crew stared in awe." This man was with his crew in a vehicle at the time. They decided, illegally, to drive into the restricted area to get a better look at this object. And they came to within 300 feet. It was completely silent. It did not appear to have any doors or windows, nor any propellers. It had a reddish-orange color. According to one of the witnesses, he said it looked like all the colors were blending together as if you were looking at a desert scene. And yet they were adamant that this object was solid. Now, at this point, the base was in chaos. Police vehicles Flashing lights were everywhere. But the object shut off its lights and was gone. Once again, radar briefly tracked it heading for Great Falls in New Brunswick, Canada, before losing it. So priority messages were sent to places throughout the military, including, I jumped ahead of my page here, the Air Force Chief of Staff and Strategic Air Command headquarters. Okay, so the question is, what was this object? As far as the military was concerned, it was a helicopter. Indeed, at times, the speed and movement of the object suggested that it was a helicopter, although no witness ever described the object physically as a helicopter. According to a defense memo, the object, quote, demonstrated a clear intent in the weapons storage area and was flown by what it considered to be a smart and most capable aviator. And yes, I would say so. Capable enough to fly in and out of an American Air Force base containing nuclear weapons with absolute ease and impunity. Capable enough to create a visual image of an object that looked nothing like a helicopter. And, oh yeah, nearly forgot, capable enough to silence all noise coming from the helicopter. That's some helicopter. By the way, I spoke with a gentleman who was a military security for many years, and told me a story of he was guarding, at that time, M1 Abrams tanks were new, still secret, or almost secret, or fairly new. A protester got into the base and climbed on top of the tank. And this guy told me, point blank, he said, I gave that guy one warning to get off the tank. He didn't, and I shot him dead. That's a story. I think it's true. I think I believe him. Here's a helicopter coming into a base, goes in 2 times, 2 nights in a row, directly over the weapons storage area, gone, nothing. No, it was not fired at, and the reason is that the base commanders were afraid of antagonizing it. This is what the evidence seems to say. The document. They didn't know what it was, and it was over some serious weapons. So, now let's move over to I think an even more interesting case over at Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan on the night of October 30th, just a day or two later. Once again, an object that resembled a helicopter, but then again, not exactly, entered restricted airspace and demonstrated interest in the weapons storage facilities. Today, Wurtsmith is closed. In the mid-1970s, it was an important Strategic Air Command base. So that night, just after 10 o'clock, an airman in the housing area at the southeastern portion of the base, I got from Yahoo Maps, you can see that that's the outline of the base there, and the circle, of course, is where it is in relation to the state. Anyway, an airman at the southeastern part saw what appeared to be the running lights of a low-flying craft near the base perimeter south of his position. It had 1 light pointing down, 2 red lights near the back. At least part of the time, the object hovered and moved up and down erratically. No sound. He couldn't hear anything. Although he did manage to hear a more distant B-52 to the north, but he couldn't hear anything from this object. A few minutes later, an airman near the main gate saw several lights close to his position, near the western edge of the base. He heard no sound again, watched the lights turn north and appear to lose altitude. This might or might not have been the same object. Then, 3 times within the next 11 minutes, security police at the back gate reported that an unidentified helicopter with no lights entered the base itself and hovered low and directly over the weapons storage area. Once again, it seemed like a helicopter, but no one could identify it, actually say, that's definitely a helicopter. No one could do that. One sergeant said he thought he heard the sound of a possible helicopter coming from an area off the base toward the north. He heard it briefly. Then the noise was drowned out by a military jet. When the jet passed, he couldn't hear a thing. That's all anyone heard. So while these visual sightings are going on, radar personnel are reporting low-flying objects, plural, in the area. It just so happened that a KC-135 tanker with 6 personnel on board was then entering the area. So this crew was ordered to identify and intercept the object or objects. So they're vectored by the base control tower plane pursued what at first appeared to be a single craft for 35 miles southeast, traveling a little faster than 200 miles per hour. After some time, the crew decided they were seeing two objects, not one, with irregularly flashing lights apparently communicating with each other. No one could be sure, though, and the radar returns could not last for more than 10 seconds at a time. They were only about 1 mile behind this thing, and every time that the crew increased speed to close the distance, the object or objects simply pulled away. So at Saginaw Bay, the tanker crew lost their quarry among fishing boat lights. As they started back, it became clear that they were involved in a nice little cat and mouse game because the object, apparently one object, decided to follow them. This is an account of what happened as told to the official base historian. On the way back, we picked up the UFO again at our 8 o'clock position. We turned away, and it proceeded to follow us. Finally, we turned back in the direction of the UFO, and it really took off back in the direction of the Bay Area. I know this might sound crazy, but I would estimate that the UFO sped away from us doing approximately 1,000 knots. That happens to be more than 1,000 miles per hour. As the plane approached the base, lights again were seen near the weapons storage area. Following the mission, the crew was cautioned not to discuss the incident. Now, to the extent that anyone tries to explain this incident, helicopter is the most typically offered one, to explain this. But of course, what helicopter is going to fly faster than 1,000 miles per hour? Now, it just so happens that the U.S. military test flew a very important craft for the very first time on September 30th, 1975, shortly before all this airspace violation business began. That's although it's ludicrous to explain this Wordsmith case with the Apache helicopter. Actually, the prototype of the Apache was the YAH-64, a Hughes aircraft. But I think it's instructive to understand some of the capabilities of this very impressive helicopter. In the first place, during late 1975, there were exactly 2 flying models of the YAH-64, and both of those models were in California. By January 1976, these 2 models, not these 2, this is the actual Apache, that's not the prototypes. I don't have pictures of the prototypes. But the 2 models that existed were both, they were both in California, and by January, they had completed about 65 flight hours total. There was not any full-scale development contract until later that year, and Apaches were not delivered to the U.S. Army until 1984. Now, from its inception, this is a very tough and very durable weapon, flying craft, although not, and reasonably quiet too, but not silent by any means. It could achieve a top speed of about 190 miles an hour and a range of about 300 miles. You could extend that range if you wanted to add external fuel tanks, which of course would affect the speed and general performance of the helicopter. But isn't all of this beside the point? Because even today, with all of its various upgrades and modifications, the Apache of the 21st century cannot do the things that were being reported by base personnel in 1975. What remains from this case are reports of a silent or near-silent aircraft able to hover and maneuver like a helicopter, but able to accelerate like a jet fighter, engaging in confrontational behavior within sensitive U.S. military installations 30 years ago. Another inexplicable event occurred a week later, November 7th, at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. This is the last of the 1975 incursions I'm going to give you any detail about. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on November 7th, electronic sensors at the base detected a violation of missile site security in an area that was designated as K7. And Malmstrom had Minuteman missiles out there and nuclear missiles. So this triggered an automatic alarm. And since there were no surveillance cameras on the area, a sabotage alert team, SAT, was ordered to investigate. As the SAT came to within a mile of area K7, the members reported by radio that they could see a brightly glowing orange disk as large as a football field hovering over the missile site. A glowing orange disc as large as a football field. So much for helicopter explanation this time. As the members of the team watched this weird thing, the launch control ordered them to proceed to the site. They refused. They did, however, continue to watch this thing, which began to rise. When it reached 1,000 feet in altitude, it began to register on NORAD radar. NORAD promptly ordered 2 F-106 interceptors to be scrambled from Malmstrom to get it. This was clearly not an ordinary object as it continued to rise, rise, rise. It eventually reached the incredible altitude of 200,000 feet, which is more than double the ceiling, say, of the high-flying U-2 spy plane. At that point, it disappeared from NORAD radar, and the jets arrived too late to see it. Later, the members of the team received a psychological examination, which indicated that they had been through a traumatic experience. The missile at K-7 showed indications that its computer targeting system had been tampered with and that it had to be removed. It was later revealed that 6 other launch control centers reported UFOs that day. And as if this were not bad enough, UFOs returned to Malmstrom the following night. NORAD radar detected unknowns heading southwest at 1,200 feet, pretty low. Once again, 2 F-106s were scrambled. Sabotage alert teams at 5 areas reported visual sightings of objects at low altitudes. Once again, the cat-and-mouse game emerged. Military witnesses on the ground reported that the UFOs turned off their lights and became invisible as the intercepting jets approached, and then turned their lights on once the jets departed. At one point, about 90 minutes into the encounter, teams in 4 different locations could see both the F-106s and the UFOs. Finally, the unknown objects rose rapidly until they were, in the words of the memo, indistinguishable from the stars. Now, it's 3 decades later now, and these events remain unexplained. So what are we talking about? Frankly, there are hundreds of similar UFO sightings that describe performance capabilities that match or even exceed what took place here. And these sightings are often very well documented and often made by military personnel. Well, it appears reasonably certain that someone has got some technology that is not acknowledged officially to this day. Now, the possibility of an alien intelligence is obvious, or extraterrestrial. Actually, I often don't like using the phrase extraterrestrial. I prefer to say advanced intelligence not from our civilization. A little more than a mouthful, I admit, but it's also a little more cautious, a little more encompassing. I don't know, for instance, that they're extraterrestrial. I don't know. I think they probably are, but I don't know this. Could it be, however, that the intrusion was actually the product of secret terrestrial or secret military technology? Now, I'm going to come back to this because it's an important issue we have to deal with. But let me have a few more minutes, and I want to describe a few other cases to you first. Essentially, though, I think that the explanation of secret technology has some serious problems. I'm not saying that it can't explain some of the interesting UFO cases we have. In fact, I think probably that it does explain several, but it's problematic, as I will explain in a few moments. The final point I want to make here about the 1975 incursions is that we have in all of this not only the incredible airspace violations, we have also at that time what seemed to be very clear evidence of some kind of covert American military action in the form of black helicopters. And that's because it was during this wave, 1975, in the Midwest especially, that people started to see these things, often flying in new air routes, often engaging in provocative actions like hovering over people's homes, often appearing in conjunction with another weird development, animal mutilations. Now, could these helicopters have been responsible for the incursions that I'm talking about here? Well, I don't think so. In the first place, they never showed evidence of extraordinary capabilities, maneuvering and so on, as happened in many of the Air Force cases here. And also, these black helicopters sounded like regular helicopters. Some have speculated that the helicopters might be some kind of anti-UFO action crew or some such thing. Who knows? Maybe. Also during that time period were two of the most spectacular abduction cases in recent history, and that was of Air Force Sergeant Charles Moody in mid-August and forestry worker Travis Walton in early November. Moody was in New Mexico, Walton was in Arizona. So lots of action going on in both of those states. When people try to explain UFOs as some psychological event, I have to remind myself and remind them of cases like these, cases that are clearly, according to the documentation we have, technological. UFOs continued to haunt American airspace through 1976. Here's a report from January 76 regarding an intrusion over Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico. And I'm really not going to bother to focus in on too many of these. You can see some of the relevant language there, describing the object fairly specifically. 25 yards in diameter, gold or silver in color with blue light on top, hole in the middle, red light on bottom. Someone saw something pretty clearly. This is another one regarding Fort Ritchie, Maryland. Okay, pretty close by, from July 30th, 1976. In the early morning hours, in this case, several patrols saw 3 oblong objects with a reddish tint. Another patrol saw a UFO over the ammo storage area about 100 to 200 yards altitude, very similar to the Loring and Wordsmith intrusions. And yet another violation reported by an Army police sergeant. One witness said the object was the size of a 2.5-ton truck. And then, of course, the now legendary Iranian jet interceptor case from September 1976. This is so well known, rather long to recount. I'm not going to recount all of it here for you. It is not necessary. However, I will just give you the bare bones because you know what? I don't like assuming that everyone knows everything. It's a bad assumption to make. You have 2 F-4 pilots. They get radar visual, intercept attempts, electrical system failures. The object itself did everything. It played cat and mouse games. It disabled the electronics and navigational systems of the pilots repeatedly. It detached smaller crafts that had incredible maneuverability that essentially gave hell to the pilots. This has been reported in detail in many books. According to Lawrence Fawcett and Barry Greenwood, who wrote about this more than 20 years ago, they wrote that reliable sources have told us the Iranian case was about 1.5 inches thick, yet absolutely no admission to having this file has come from any government agency with a possible connection to the case. And this report, by the way, came to us courtesy of a very liberal Freedom of Information Act that no longer exists. The case was briefly mentioned in the Iranian News, the newspaper, the day after it happened. The details were obtained in 1977 by a man named Charles Huffer, who was a teacher at the Berlin American High School in Germany. He initially requested the document from the Secretary of Defense, which was denied. He appealed the decision and got a release of a 3-page message about the report through the Defense Intelligence Agency, all rather quickly, I might add. An addendum to the report added, quote, "An outstanding report. This case is a classic which meets all the criteria necessary for a valid study of the UFO phenomenon." I seriously doubt it would be anywhere nearly that easy to get a Freedom of Information Act request regarding a case nowadays. And in fact, we know this is true regarding the Washington case from just a year and a half ago. FOIA requests have repeatedly gotten nowhere, and I'm going to get to that before we leave. By the way, the same night as the Iranian sighting was a heck of a sighting in Morocco, and Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State, was consulted on this and basically shut his own embassy in Morocco out of the loop by giving them the old tired story that the Condon Committee laid UFOs to rest. Maybe it was a meteor you saw, although the details of that case do not indicate meteor. Now, there are several interesting CIA memos from 1976 pertaining to UFOs. One is from April, confirms that the agency continues to monitor UFO phenomena, but not officially, whatever that means. Remember Helms' statement, nothing on paper. Well, corollary might be, don't make your programs official. Another memo from April stated that the Domestic Collections Division, quote, has been receiving UFO-related material. These materials came from science and technology sources, and their credentials removed them from the nut variety. And it referred to CIA UFO experts as well. And then another one from July of that year kind of restates this. It mentions the fact that the Domestic Collections Divisions has been receiving UFO-related material from many of our science and technology sources. So one question might be, what sort of UFO material was arriving at the CIA's Domestic Collections Division? Whatever it was, it appears that there was an active research and development being done on UFOs at CIA in the 1970s. Now, sorry about the yucky pictures in there. I tried to keep them small in size. I mention this case because it appears linked to unknown aerial phenomena. This is from a June 1976 declassified report by the New Mexico State Police, declassified by the FBI, about cattle mutilations. It talks about removal of body parts with, quote, what appeared to be a sharp, precise instrument. It also noted the evidence for an apparent landing. It said a suspected aircraft of some type had landed twice, leaving 3 pod marks positioned in a triangular shape. The diameter of each pod was 14 inches. The perimeter around the 3 pods was 16.5 inches. Emanating from the 2 landings were smaller triangular-shaped tripods, 25 inches and 4 inches in diameter. They really looked into this. Investigation at the scene showed these small tripods followed the cow for approximately 600 feet. Tracks of the cow showed where she had struggled and fallen. This is all the report I'm reading here. The small tripod tracks were all around the cow. Other evidence showed, the report continues, that the grass around the tripods as they followed the cow had been scorched. And finally, there was also evidence that the tripod marks had returned and removed the left ear. Investigation has also revealed that in all cattle mutilations which have occurred in New Mexico and surrounding states, that the object of the mutilations has been the lymph node system. End quote. That's an official report. Thank you, Freedom of Information Act. There were lots of interesting military encounters around the world by U.S. and non-U.S. military personnel in 1977, 1978. I'm going to spare you the details. Basically more of the same. In fact, in 1978, there's essentially a pandemic UFO wave. I mean, much of the world is having significant UFO sightings. I keep losing here we go. Now, this is a snapshot taken by a 16-year-old Iranian boy. He was up late studying for exams. He saw and photographed this object from the window of his family's apartment in the town of Shiraz. This photo caused a stir among UFO researchers because it resembled a UFO report by pilots during their landing approach to Tehran airport earlier in this year. Then, in October 1978, 4 months later, this object, or something exactly like it, was photographed by another person in Iran, Franklin Uri, from outside his home in western Iran. This picture, however, was not revealed until the Uri family relocated to the United States 3 years later. A Freedom of Information Act request and lawsuit ultimately led to the release of Defense Department documents which had this. This was in defense files that revealed the American military's interest in these sightings. There's a comparison of the two. You know, that is clearly the same object. Now here's a drawing. This is rather similar, except that this drawing is from 1967, and it's by a man named Stefan Mikhailik, describing a craft that he saw in the woods in Canada. I wrote about this in Volume 1. And it's an event where he received injuries from the exhaust blast of the ship. It's a well-known event for which, by the way, the Condon Committee offered the hoax hypothesis. The evidence for hoax is very slim. Very slim. The evidence for the authenticity of the encounter, I think, is very strong. One of the strongest is the fact that this man got incredibly ill for months after that account. In fact, there's a famous picture of him lying in a hospital bed with marks from the exhaust all over his body, all over his chest. I'm sure many of you have seen this. Throughout the remainder of the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, there are good cases of military involvement with UFOs. There's an interesting 1980 case involving the Peruvian Air Force with a UFO. It's noted in American Defense Intelligence Agency documents. This was a good UFO report, good witness. The conclusion in the report was origin remains unknown. Another interesting Kuwaiti case from 1980, reported by the American Embassy there. Several RAF encounters in November. Then, of course, the monumental case by American servicemen in the Rendlesham Forest at the RAF American base at Bentwaters in England. This was a series of encounters that the skeptics cannot kill, try though they might. In addition to all of these, frequently with military personnel, it is equally obvious that the CIA was doing some careful work monitoring the UFO situation around the world, just as they had been doing for decades. There are many reports of CIA monitoring UFO organizations and events in foreign countries like China, Soviet Union, Europe, Africa, everywhere. What we don't get is a whole lot of interesting commentary independent from the reports themselves. In other words, very, very straightforward, rather boring accounts of things that happen, not much commentary at all. Maybe they exist somewhere. Some of these sightings, let's just make this clear, of the reports that they're looking at were of very terrestrial technology. For instance, Soviet rocket launches, weapons testing in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation, things like that. Yet as you get deeper into the 1980s, you start getting reliable sightings of triangular objects that are definitely terrestrial. For instance, in August 8, 1989, a former Royal Observer Corps member who's working on a North Sea gas rig about 60 miles off the British coast spotted a matte black aircraft refueling from a KC-135 tanker. It was accompanied by two F-111s. Now, these are not photographs, okay? The aircraft, he said, was a perfect triangle. The object was an isosceles triangle with a 30-degree angle at the nose. It was slightly bigger than an F-111. This formation was heading toward the British coast. This man's name was Chris Gibson. Chris Gibson has been written about. He has been described as a master of the art of aircraft recognition. This man competed in international recognition tournaments where a long-distance shot of an aircraft would be flashed on a screen for a fraction of a second. That's who this is the man who identified the triangle. Now, assuming Gibson was accurate about the size of the aircraft, and everyone who's looked at this case is sure that he was, this is not the triangular craft that was seen in the Hudson Valley of New York State a couple of years earlier. The Hudson Valley sightings are, in a way, pivotal in our understanding of this so-called terrestrial or alien technology question. Here you're talking about enormous triangular craft seen by thousands of people. Hovering low, silent, extreme acceleration in all directions, invasion of the airspace twice at least of the Indian Point nuclear power station, during which one time it disabled the electrical and communications systems. This is a drawing over there of by one of the security guards at the plant. In fact, what happened was the object came into the plant, this enormous object. He described it as about almost 900 feet long, and hovered over the only operating reactor. The man in charge of the plant security called the National Guard. He said, "I want you to get a helicopter over here and shoot this thing down." Meanwhile, he had the guards with their rifles aimed at this object. He was going to order them to shoot the object. The guards are thinking, how are we going to shoot this thing down? They had no way of doing that. And as, in fact, that he was about to give an order, apparently, to have them engage the object just went away. Now, actually, the photograph on the top left, top to your right, I'm sorry, is a photograph that's part of a video, actually. That's a still frame from the same day. The Indian Point facility had its airspace violation July 24th, 1984. That video was taken the same day. by a man in that same area. Could be the same object. You can't really make out the shape from that. However, that video was sent and was analyzed by a number of organizations, including ABC News and the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California. The Jet Propulsion Lab looked this over very carefully. Conclusion, unknown. In other words, they were unable to identify it as any kind of conventional aircraft. And that's all that they would say. Now here's another triangle. We've all seen this one. This is seen over Belgium a few years later. That's the unlight-enhanced version. Here it is a little lightened. This is from 1990. The Belgium sightings are another of those milestones in the UFO phenomenon. Like many other spectacular sightings in the past, the encounters over Belgium in 1989 and 1990 happened amid a wave of major sightings in that region, in this case all over Europe. A great deal of activity was going on in the Soviet Union, as that country was already in the process of collapsing into chaos. The Belgian case is essentially one of these cases, once again, of a technology that's not supposed to exist. It's not just the plan form or the design of this craft. It's a perfect triangle. It's the performance characteristics. F-116 interceptors could not catch it. This object was equally at ease doing 30 miles an hour as 1,500 miles per hour at instant acceleration, by the way. The documentation on this case is just too good. At one point, Belgian Air Force radar tracked this object. Well, there possibly were more than one triangle, actually. This is one of them. But at one point, the Air Force radar tracked it descending 4,000 feet in 1 second. That's nearly a mile in 1 second. Now, you know, what can do that? And the press coverage, by the way, was simply ridiculous. Mostly it was simply absent. I really think this kind of thing is just embarrassing to report. Let's not forget that, of course, the real national security connections to major media. This has been well documented for a long time. But the coverage of these spectacular events is nearly as spectacular for their ineptness as for the event itself, for the ineptness of the coverage. I think the secret keepers have learned that the best thing that they can do is just to ignore. Don't try to refute. You know, that just makes it worse. Just be silent. This is a change, a definite change in U.S. government policy over the last few decades. The silence, I think, has become more brazen, in my view. You know, sure, in this case, you get a couple of debunking New York Times articles about this months after the fact, poorly reported, as you would expect. No one asks the right questions. Like regarding this. Many reliable witnesses observed what were clearly military UFOs darting and maneuvering in central Nevada in ways that were non-aerodynamic. This is a photo over here taken by Gary Schultz on February 28, 1990. Schultz and his wife went out to the place known as the Mailbox to watch the show. Everyone knew by this point. He had heard Lazar on the radio. Lazar's talking about, yeah, we're going out there, we're watching all of these things go out. Gary Schultz said, holy smoke. And he was expecting a major mob to appear there, and no one was there. He was out there with his wife. One of the things about UFOs, we continually overestimate the interest that these amazing things are going to generate. We can see the enormous implications, and then we think, well, it's just so easy for everyone else to recognize how major a thing this is, and yet people don't get it. So Schultz is out there and his wife, he's got his lawn chair. 7:30 p.m., the first craft came out. He was astounded, leaped out of his lawn chair, took some pictures. And every 45 minutes, one of these came up. There were 6 in all. And 2 or 3 of the craft he described as absolutely amazing. They were brightly pulsating, and he captured this one here rather nicely with a cheap little camera, in fact. Now, I want to stop for a moment and go into the issue of who the heck is making this stuff. When I wrote my book a few years ago, I would have been more adamant in saying that this is not ours. I'm a little less certain of that now. I'm not saying that all UFOs are terrestrial. I do not believe that, actually. by no means. I personally feel that the evidence weighs very strongly toward the primary origin of these as being not from our civilization. But I also believe that there is evidence pointing to the fact that we possess, for all practical purposes, UFO types of technologies. For instance, when I wrote my book, I did not know of a very interesting book by aviation journalist Nick Cook, who wrote a book called The Hunt for Zero Point. In fact, I didn't know about it because my book came out before his. Nick Cook wrote for Jane's Defense Weekly, probably the most prestigious military publication in the world. He was their senior aviation editor. I think he's still there. Does anyone know if Nick Cook is still working for Jane's, or is he gone? Does anyone know this? Someone told me he's no longer there. It would be interesting if that were the case. Anyway, against his initial better judgment, Cook investigated rumors of secret anti-gravity technology, in particular the claims that the Germans had indeed been working on this during World War II. Now, anytime, anyone with any experience in the UFO field has heard this kind of thing, to say the least. It's not my goal here to give you Cook's book, but suffice to say that I for one, was persuaded that he found something, more than just some smoke, maybe a little fire. What it appears is that the Nazis had some advanced designs using unconventional physics that happened to work, at least at the prototype level. And Cook then argued that the Americans got the lion's share of the technology and key personnel after the war through Project Paperclip. Now, again, this is not saying that Americans invented flying saucers after World War II. He had no evidence for this, none. By his own analysis, he argues that it looks like the Americans only got going into this in a serious way in maybe the mid-1950s, and that there were really no breakthroughs, if any, until the 1960s. And he was very equivocal about this. He seems to think that a breakthrough occurred at that time. For myself, I think it's entirely possible that a secret breakthrough was made, but I would put the time closer to the 1980s. Of course, we're all guessing here. What Nick Cook's book did do, essentially, is muddy up the waters a little bit so that when we look at the 1975 intrusions that I described earlier, I can't entirely rule out that some secret group somewhere had the technology at this time. I still don't think that is the case, but I'm not willing to rule it out entirely or as completely as I might have done a year ago. And here's another reason why. Ben Rich was the hand-picked successor of Skunkworks founder Kelly Johnson. Ben Rich was a man famous for the stealth fighter, the F-117, as well as the Have Blue stealth prototype, and the top-secret F-19 stealth interceptor. In 1986, John Andrews, himself a legendary Lockheed engineer and chief model kit designer for the Tester Corporation, wrote to Rich about UFOs. And essentially, Ben Rich was a friend of Andrews. Essentially, Andrews asked, are the UFOs ours or theirs? And Rich replied, I believe both. He said, in another correspondence, which I don't have the graphic here, I'm sorry, that there are two types of UFOs, the ones we build and the ones they build. Rich said to Andrews that we learned from both crash retrievals and actual hand-me-downs. Rich maintained that the government knew and until 1969 took an active hand in the administration of that information. He claimed that after 1969, a Nixon purge in '69, that the administration was handled by an international board of directors in the private sector. Ben Rich also said that a craft was recovered at Roswell in 1947, that the hull design, aerodynamic measurements, propulsion info were passed on directly to Jack Northrop and Kelly Johnson around 1950, with a major block of data being passed on from the working group at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base's Foreign Technologies Division in 1952. Rich also observed that the impression Kelly Johnson had of the aliens was negative, and that Kelly Johnson implied, in the few times that they discussed this, that factions from out there were a threat more than a blessing, and that the cost of having them around was, in the words of Kelly Johnson, unimaginable and unbelievable. Ben Rich also believed, according to his statement to John Andrews, that the public should not be told. He believed that we could not handle the truth ever. In the very last months of his life, he began to feel that the International Corporate Board of Directors dealing with the subject could represent a bigger problem to citizens' personal freedoms than the presence of the aliens themselves. Andrews himself died in 1999 and passed this information on to Bill McDonald, a UFO researcher. There are other sources regarding Ben Rich. Ben Rich was a graduate of the UCLA School of Engineering, and in 1993 gave an alumni speech there. He ended his speech with a slide image. This was described by Bill Hamilton, who knows this case very well. He ended it with a slide of a black disc zooming up into the atmosphere. The presentation was on like the history of skunk works. That ended with this like black flying saucer going up. And his last statement was, "We now have the technology to take ET home." Ended it, and of course was mobbed by all of the people in attendance, and made these statements. We now know how to travel to the stars. There is an error in the equations, and we have figured it out and now know how to travel to the stars, and it won't take a lifetime to do it. He also said it is time to end all the secrecy on this, as it no longer poses a national security threat, and make the technology available for use in the private sector. And then he also said in so many words that there are many in the intelligence community who would like to see this stay in the black and not see the light of day. Rumors of anti-gravity and field propulsion have been leaking out for more than 15 years at the least. I sometimes refer to Area 51 as the land of leaks. During the 1980s, aerospace journalist James Goodall cultivated a number of inside sources from Groom Lake at Area 51. He asked one of them, "Do you believe in UFOs?" Guy said, "Absolutely, positively, they do exist. Absolutely, positively, they do exist." At a later date, the same source told Goodall, quote, "We have things in the Nevada desert that would make George Lucas envious." There's Star Wars technology for you, quite literally. Now, how many other sources have many of us encountered or read about over the years that say essentially the same thing? Now, I acknowledge, yes, you cannot take all these people blindly at their word. But even if you are very, very cautious in taking all of this, you know, as Ricky said to Lucy, you got a lot of splaining to do. There's a lot of these things coming out, and they are very, very consistent. Journalist George Knapp, for instance, has interviewed many additional insiders from Area 51, as well as many people with other kinds of connections in there, basically getting very compatible information. Then, of course, there's Bob Lazar and his claims of alien technology at Area 51. Lazar has been a lightning rod for controversy, that's true, but it is also true that his claims are the small tip of a large iceberg. And I will tell you this, I've tried, like many, to find out what's the deal with Lazar, how truthful is he being. Since my book came out, some people like to correspond with me of all walks of life, some of them seemingly well plugged in. I asked one of them, "What do you think about Lazar? What do you know about Lazar? Let's trade, can you trade any information with me?" This guy told me, he absolutely confirmed that Lazar did work at S4 at Area 51. Now, I think that this man is very credible. He could not confirm that Lazar worked on the sports model alien vehicle, but he did say, yes, I have it on good information, he said, that Lazar was at S4. So take it for what it's worth. Now, this is a case that happened a couple of years ago in Illinois. The main thing I want to do regarding this is simply discuss how the media so stupidly decided to handle this case. This is an incident in which at about 4:30 in the morning, a bunch of maybe 10 people, including perhaps 5 or so police officers, saw an enormous triangle, low, maybe 500 feet, silent, doing all the things that these triangles do, going right over. 2 stories high, brightly lit windows or lights along the side, huge, gliding very slowly, and then the last thing it did is went, zoom, took off instantly. Now, I remember when this came out in the media coverage of this, and I, again, was astonished. It was 4 years ago, and you get the smiles and the, little cute, ha-ha, little green men. And then really where they leave you is that, well, this is probably some kind of military technology. And then they just leave it alone. And I keep thinking, all right, fine, military technology. Doesn't anyone want to know what makes this thing go? What is the technology? Yes, sir?
Do you have the audio from that?
I do not have the audio. I know that there's audio available, isn't there?
Yeah, the police department, they were really chasing all over the place, and they were walking back and forth. I'm chasing it down the street right now, and right below it.
Yeah, audio of police pursuing this object. I'm chasing it. Yeah, very exciting. I've heard about this. I've not heard it directly. I've seen some transcript, I think, of it. So it's a heck of a case, and utterly and totally bungled. The wrong questions are asked. Forget aliens for a second. And that's an important point, but we get hung up on this. The fact is that there's something extraordinary. I grew up in the New York City area, catch a lot of Mets and Yankee games on TV. When a plane flies over Shea Stadium, I can tell you, you hear that thing. Those are 747s. They're loud. This thing is bigger, way bigger than a 747. Much lower, and you can't hear it. And it has performance capabilities like nothing we know about. So if it's military, what do we become, like these czarist little peasants? And we're just going to sit around and wait for the military to tell us when we're allowed to use this stuff. Because it's a matter of national security, and that's what it means. We have no questions are being asked. The wrong questions are being asked, and the right questions are not being asked. And finally, F-16s pursue unknown craft over a region. At this conference was one of the main witnesses to this encounter. I just met him yesterday. Rennie. Great guy. Has anyone met this man? He came up to my table. He said, "I'm Rennie." I said, "What?" "Oh, that Rennie." This is an incredible case. And in fact, the Washington Post absolutely did not cover the most interesting aspects of this case, as I learned from this man. What happened was, on the 50th anniversary of the famous 1952 overflight of the Capitol, on July 27th, 2002, okay? People woke up 1:30 in the morning in, I think the town is Waldorf, Maryland. Right. They hear loud jets overhead. Rennie goes outside, and other people, about 6 to 8 people, call their local radio station, WTOP, and they say, "I see F-16 jets chasing this object." Well, it was an object. Here's the description he gave me. This is not in the Post article. The Post article simply said that there is an alleged blue object that was being chased by F-16s. That's sort of true. But this is what actually happened. He worked late. He got home at about 1 o'clock. He's watching TV at 1:30. Hears the noise, runs out of his house, looks up, sees the jets going in this direction. He's thinking, what the heck are they chasing? He looks around and sees in this part of the sky this bluish object descending at a steep angle, coming down, and then stopping. The jets then were pursuing it again, and this object went boom, went off. And he said to me this was not simply a light. He saw, in his view, it was definable as an object. That's what he saw. So what happened was a bunch of people called the radio station. WTOP issued the first press release on this. And it is my opinion, I don't know this, but that's probably the only reason the Washington Post wrote about this at all, because it had already been scooped, it had already been out. There was some local Fox coverage and local CNN coverage, one time each. This story dropped into the black hole. The official Air Force statement in the Washington Post article, with the Post you get the basic, well, maybe it's this and maybe it's that. So the Post article quoted Rennie, and then quoted this Air Force talking head who said, well, I love this, it could have been any number of things. I'd like to know what things it could have been. What's option A, what's option B, what's option C? We don't know this. I'd like to know. So in any case, the significant thing about this is a post 9/11 case. And this object was this close to the restricted perimeter around Washington. Didn't go, was very close to it. NORAD had it on radar. An unnamed Air Force spokesman, by the way, said on the condition of anonymity that the object suddenly just faded off the radar. Like they had it on radar and it just went gone. So, now it's not such a great stretch to assume that we have got some exotic technology that remains unacknowledged, but there are some difficult questions here. First, why do so many encounters between American military aircraft and UFOs seem to be confrontational? It's quite clear from the accounts described here and from others that the American Air Force pilots have been sent on genuine intercept missions for decades to pursue objects that don't look or behave like ordinary aircraft, which outperform the most advanced aircraft of our day. And we don't even today have anything, officially at least, that can match the performance of UFOs from the 1950s. And I make this statement based solely from the data gleaned through official military records and through documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. Secondly, if many of these UFOs are terrestrial, for instance, let's say the objects from 1975 were human origin, we have to face some disturbing implications, like the likelihood of an organization outside the scope of any official establishment possessing better technology than that of the U.S. military, which would be superior to any aircraft the U.S. military can officially put on the battlefield today in the 21st century. That's a big deal. We could be talking about a rogue element in our own civilization that's secret, extremely powerful, and answers to nothing. For more information on this matter, please see Jim Mars. And I don't rule out such possibilities. But as a matter of explanation, this is not any easier to accept, frankly, than that of alien visitation or an alien presence. And actually, I think the human explanation poses greater problems of explanation when you look at the entire UFO phenomenon, not just one small segment like airspace violations. My own position is that when discussing UFOs, we have to distinguish between ours and theirs, just like what Ben Rich said. I think there are both. I believe in caution when speculating on these matters, but I also believe that when you have the facts in front of you, you have to face them. You have to be forthright. The truth itself is a radical thing, and the truth is something that belongs to all of us. And the truth is like the Hindu goddess Shiva. It's the creator and destroyer of worlds. And it is not done with us yet. The fact, undeniable, and facing us everywhere we turn, is that there is radically advanced technology on this planet that is not being publicly acknowledged. Technology that likely can take people to the stars and back, and much, much more. It looks to me like such technology is here on Earth today, right now. The unproven issue remains, to whom does it belong? And the process of facing this fact will be probably more socially disruptive than anything that I can think about. I think it would easily shatter the very structure of power in our society today. And that's only another incentive to learn the truth and to speak it. Back to our Spanish general friend from 1976. He talked about the possible release of information in the future once the classified world figures out what's going on. Well, you know, sorry, that's just not a realistic way to look at this. Let me just say, UFO disclosure has nothing to do with getting our facts straight. The militaries of the world, they've had more than 50 years to get their facts straight. I think by now, they can have a clue. Maybe not all the blanks filled in, but a general idea? Yeah, I think so. Regarding the release of UFO information, I continue to believe the best analogy that I can think of is that of the Soviet Union from 1985. I may have mentioned this in my lecture briefly. 1985, you have Mikhail Gorbachev coming in, talking about glasnost, a major thing. 70 years of that country's history had been built on lies, murder, falsification of history. Suddenly, openness, restructuring, what's this all about? And it was an amazing thing. And, you know, Gorbachev was for real, and 6 years later, there's no Soviet Union. It all went away. Why? Well, the reason is that reforms spiraled absolutely out of control. You want to reform from the inside, so we'll do this little thing here, but that causes these things to happen, and that causes these and these and these, and suddenly you have a situation totally out of control. Lithuanians and Latvians and Estonians say, hey, we don't want to be here anymore. You annexed us in 1940. Azerbaijanis, we don't want to be here. Everything gone. The same thing would happen today. If the President of the United States were to say to you, all right, let's say disclosure happens. President Bush says, you know, UFOs apparently are real and they're alien. Okay, it's come to my attention. So then, you know, you've got how many follow-up questions here? Well, gee, Mr. President, what does that say about alien abductions? Suddenly, they don't seem so far out, do they? What does that say about claims that we've got secret technology that's alien-derived? What does that say about rumors of alien bases underground? Suddenly, it's a whole new ballgame, and everything is up for grabs. There is too much at stake for those who have these secrets to want to give them up. They have no incentive to do so. I want to leave you with a quote of one of my very favorite writers, which is Niccolo Machiavelli. I quote him frequently. This is important. 500 years ago, Machiavelli explained how to have a revolution from above without most people even noticing. He said, this is in his discourses on Livy, if you're going to do this, you have to retain the semblance of the old forms, because that's all people notice. You know, in other words, President, Congress, Supreme Court, keep that in mind. So that it may seem to the people that there's been no change in the institutions, even though in fact they are entirely different from the old ones. Keep the old structures because that's what people will see. So instead of seeing a corpse of a republic in which we live, we see only the dead guy's clothing because they look the same as they ever did. We've had a quiet revolution that has not eliminated our congressional representatives, it's just made them irrelevant to a large extent. Now, I'm very interested in discussing the reality of a secret state. I think that such a thing is real. Rather, what I think is going on is something like the coexistence of multiple states. They intersect all the time. There's the official state, Congress, President, you know, the stuff we're supposed to believe in. Then there's the criminal state, filled with people of unconscionable wealth and corruption who basically do whatever they want, and they're above the law. And then there's the secret state. Sometimes I call this the national security state. And I keep trying to think these ideas through, but I think they intersect all the time, these things. And incidentally, I think what's going on today is that the veil of the secret state is slowly being lifted, bit by bit, out of necessity, frankly. We've undergone so much radical political transformation, and this began long before 9/11, but 9/11 certainly accelerated things, that at a certain point it becomes impossible to hide the changes. So Machiavelli's advice to keep the changes hidden, you can't follow that advice forever, simply because the changes have been so profound, so expansive, that it becomes impossible not to notice. Along these lines, I'm not going to get overly political, but I grew up in a household that was partly conservative, partly liberal, my mother and dad. And I have a appreciation for both of those angles of looking at things. I honestly, truly do. When people describe our president as conservative, I want to correct them, because that is not conservative as I grew up understanding the term. Conservative is someone who supposedly doesn't trust government power. What I describe our president as a neoconservative, and this is a man who's in love with the state. He has a love affair with the state. And that is not simply a Republican thing, okay? But this is not conservatism, as I grew up understanding it. The problem that people are having these days, this vast, pitiless crisis of identity and belief that you see everywhere around you, we all see this every day in the eyes of any person with a brain in their head. The problem is that they have lost faith in their society, and they don't see anything to replace that. That there's no alternative to what they see of a society that is no longer based on personal freedom, but rather on wealth, the wealth of a planet that is rapidly diminishing its resources, by the way, and diminishing in its time. So everything I've given you today still begs the question of what is behind the UFO phenomenon. My goal, as everyone keeps saying, as I say, is more limited than that true. But I try to be a little more focused as a result. And I want you to come away from this not with a blueprint for how to start the new age of harmony with the Cosmic Federation. I'm more interested in you coming away with a strong feeling of civic obligation and a renewed commitment to the ideals of the American Republic. Lest we forget, these are commitments above all to truth and self-government. And a true study of the UFO phenomenon is not divorced from these commitments. It is not separate. We must study UFOs not merely as scientists, but as citizens engaged, citizens, pardon me, in a free republic. That is all I have to say. Thank you. I know it's a little bit after 5. I will gladly stick around for any questions that you may have. I know we also have got other, dinner obligation, whatever is going on next, but if there's any questions that you have, I can answer them here. Yes, sir.
You were showing some animal mutilation. Have you come across any data of human mutilation?
Human mutilation. Well, I have not come across any data of human mutilations. I have come across stories of human mutilation. And, for instance, I have spoken with, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to mention his name yet. I probably will mention it in my book. A gentleman who's a fairly experienced UFO researcher, former police officer as well, who has a lot of connections within some of the police world, and looked into accounts of human mutilation. Told me that at a certain point he hit a brick wall beyond which he was absolutely not, he was told, you don't go into this. Now, human beings get mutilated, and we do it to ourselves, obviously, but you're talking about the kinds of surgical, precise mutilations. All that I can tell you for myself is I have not encountered a case that I would say is an absolute slam dunk. I've heard some very, very grisly stories from people who seem to be credible, but I can't really do anything with it. So I don't know. I don't know. Any other questions? Well, I think we're all going to get some food and have some fun. I will gladly, if you stop by my table, if I'm around, I'll gladly chat, or if we bump into each other outside. Thank you very much. How does this hang up here?
And I work with a gentleman, his name is Richard Dolan, and he told
Do
me
you really?
to tell you hello.
Oh, tell him I said hi.
Yes.
Right back at him.
He pulled up some of the stuff on the computer for me, and the names. And
he said, "Who is this
"Are you going to
bozo?"
go here?
Great.
I was wondering about that guy in Canada. It's actually Gary's question. He had to leave it.
The Canadian from 1967?
Yeah, the guy who suffered from burns.
Yeah, right, exactly. Stephen McCallick.
Were they radiation burns?
Yeah, yes, they were. In fact, there were radiation burns in the form of a checker pattern. In fact, in that image that I showed, the craft